There's a version of a narcissist almost nobody talks about because it doesn't fit the confident, self-assured caricature we've all been trained to picture. The loud, grandiose, unshakable figure who seems to move through the world with total, untouchable certainty. But underneath that performance, in the vast majority of cases, there's something the person themselves would never willingly reveal, something so carefully hidden that even they, most of the time, aren't fully conscious of how much pain it actually represents. Today we're talking about the 5 hidden signs that reveal a narcissist isn't thriving behind that performance at all. They're suffering, quietly, constantly, in ways that shape almost every behavior you've ever found confusing about them. Let's start with something important, because this entire episode could easily be misread as an excuse for harmful behavior, and that's not the intention here. Understanding that a narcissist suffers internally doesn't mean their behavior stops being damaging, doesn't mean you owe them patience or forgiveness you're not ready to give, and doesn't mean their actions aren't fully their responsibility to address. What it does mean is that recognizing this suffering can help you understand the actual mechanics of what you've experienced, rather than continuing to interpret their behavior through a lens that never quite made sense on its own terms. Let's begin with the first hidden sign. An almost compulsive need to be the center of every conversation, even ones that have nothing to do with them. This gets read, understandably, as arrogance, as an inflated sense of self-importance. But underneath that surface reading, there's something much sadder actually happening. A person whose internal sense of worth is genuinely stable doesn't need every conversation to circle back to them, because their value doesn't depend on constant confirmation. The compulsive redirection toward themselves, turning your bad day into a story about their worse one, turning your achievement into an opportunity to mention their own die, isn't actually evidence of confidence. It's evidence of a person who experiences genuine, almost physical discomfort at the idea of not being centered, because being decentered, even briefly, threatens an identity that was never actually built on solid internal ground in the first place. This compulsion reveals something important. A person operating from genuine security can sit comfortably in someone else's spotlight, can celebrate someone else's moment without needing to insert themselves into it because their own sense of mattering isn't threatened by someone else briefly mattering more in a given moment. The narcissist's inability to do this, however irritating and exhausting it is to witness repeatedly, is actually a window into a genuinely uncomfortable internal experience. One where every moment not spent being the center of attention registers somewhere below conscious awareness as a small, quiet threat to their entire sense of existing at all. The second hidden sign. An extreme, sometimes explosive reaction to even minor criticism, disproportionate to whatever was actually said. This gets read, often correctly on the surface, as an inability to handle accountability. But the deeper layer underneath this reaction reveals something more specifically painful. For a narcissist, criticism doesn't register the way it does for someone with a more integrated sense of self. A person with stable self-worth can hear "you made a mistake here" and process it as information about a specific action, separate from their overall value as a person. A narcissist's psychological architecture, however, often doesn't have that separation built in. Criticism of a specific action gets processed almost instantaneously as an indictment of their entire identity, because their identity was never actually built with enough internal stability to withstand the idea that one part of them might be flawed, while the rest remains fundamentally okay. This is exactly why even the gentlest, most carefully delivered feedback can trigger a reaction that seems wildly out of proportion to what was actually said. Because from the narcissist's internal experience, it isn't disproportionate at all. It genuinely feels like an attack on their entire right to exist as a worthwhile person, which is an exhausting, precarious way to move through a world that inevitably, for everyone, involves being wrong sometimes. The third hidden sign, an inability to be alone with their own thoughts for extended periods, often masked by constant busyness, constant need for stimulation, constant surrounding of themselves with people, activity, or noise. This one is subtle because it doesn't look like suffering from the outside. it often looks like an enviably active, social, engaged life. But underneath, there's frequently something much more troubling happening. Silence and solitude, for many narcissists, create space for exactly the kind of internal reflection their entire psychological structure was built to avoid. Without external stimulation, without someone else's attention to organize their sense of self around, there's a real risk of encountering something underneath the performance that feels genuinely unbearable, an emptiness, a fragility, a nagging sense that the confident persona everyone sees isn't actually connected to anything solid underneath it. This is why so many narcissists seem to need constant company, constant activity, constant external validation running in the background at almost all times, and why unstructured alone time, which most people experience as restful or even pleasant, often produces a kind of restless, anxious discomfort in someone with this pattern. It's not that they simply prefer being around people. It's that being alone, genuinely alone, without distraction, risks confronting exactly the internal void their entire outward presentation was constructed to keep hidden from others and often from themselves as well. The fourth hidden sign: a pattern of quickly discarding people or relationships the moment those people stop providing something the narcissist needs, followed almost immediately by devaluing them retroactively, rewriting the relationship's history to make the ending feel justified rather than what it actually was, which is a loss. This gets read correctly as callousness, but there's a specific mechanism underneath this pattern that reveals something genuinely sad. The speed and completeness of this discarding often reflects an inability to actually process loss and grief the way most people can. Rather than sitting with the discomfort of missing someone, feeling the sting of a relationship ending, tolerating the vulnerability of genuine grief, the narcissist's psychological system often short-circuits directly into devaluation, because devaluing the lost person or relationship is far less painful than actually feeling the loss of them. This means that behind almost every narcissist's rapid, seemingly heartless pivot away from someone they once claimed to deeply care about, there's often an unprocessed grief that never actually got metabolized, simply papered over with a hastily constructed narrative that makes moving on feel instant and painless, rather than what it might have actually been underneath the surface, if they'd ever had the capacity to sit with it honestly. The fifth hidden sign, and the one that ties everything else together: an underlying, almost constant sense of emptiness that no amount of external achievement, admiration, or validation ever seems to actually fill, no matter how much of it accumulates. This is, in many ways, the core wound underneath every other pattern we've discussed today. Most people, when they achieve something meaningful, receive some level of lasting satisfaction from it, not perfect, not permanent, but real, sustaining, something that becomes part of a genuine internal sense of accomplishment. For many narcissists, this satisfaction simply doesn't land the same way, or doesn't last nearly as long as it should. The achievement provides a brief spike of validation, followed almost immediately by a return to the same underlying emptiness that existed before, which means the pursuit of the next achievement, the next source of admiration, the next relationship to extract validation from, becomes compulsive and endless, precisely because nothing ever actually resolves the emptiness driving the entire search in the first place. This is exhausting to witness from the outside, and it's exhausting in a much deeper and more constant way to actually live inside, though the person experiencing it rarely has the language or the self-awareness to describe it this clearly, even to themselves. It's a hunger that food never actually satisfies, no matter how much of it gets consumed, which means every external success, every relationship, every accomplishment ultimately becomes just another temporary distraction from a void that the narcissist's entire psychological architecture was built specifically to avoid looking at directly. Now, I want to say something important before we move into the second half of this conversation, because it's the piece that determines whether this understanding actually helps you or simply becomes another way of getting pulled back into caretaking someone who's hurt you. Recognizing these 5 hidden signs of suffering doesn't obligate you to fix it, doesn't mean you owe them the emotional labor of helping them heal, and absolutely doesn't mean their behavior toward you was ever acceptable simply because it originated from pain. Their suffering is real. Your right to protect yourself from the damage that suffering causes is equally real, and neither one cancels out the other. And this is exactly where we're headed next. What this suffering actually explains about the specific behaviors you've experienced firsthand. Why understanding it changes how you relate to your own anger and hurt without requiring you to excuse anything. And why, ultimately, this understanding is far more useful for your own healing than it will ever be for theirs. Let's talk about why understanding this suffering actually matters for your healing specifically rather than theirs. Because this distinction is the entire reason this conversation is worth having at all. Here's the trap almost everyone falls into once they start understanding the internal suffering underneath narcissistic behavior. The assumption that understanding automatically implies forgiveness, or worse, that it implies you should stay, try harder, extend more patience, because now you finally understand why they did what they did. I want to be direct about this because it matters enormously. Understanding the mechanism behind someone's cruelty does not obligate you to keep absorbing that cruelty. A person suffering from an untreated illness can still transmit real harm to the people around them, and recognizing the illness doesn't require you to remain in its path indefinitely, hoping your continued presence will somehow heal something that, in most cases, only a committed, long-term, professionally guided process could ever actually shift. So why does this understanding matter at all if it doesn't change what you owe them? Because it changes something enormous about what you owe yourself. Specifically, it changes the story you've been carrying about your own worth throughout the entire relationship. Here's what I mean by that. For most people who've spent real time with a narcissist, there's a lingering, corrosive question that persists long after the relationship ends. What was wrong with me that this person treated me the way they did? This question makes a certain kind of intuitive sense because most human relationships operate on a rough principle of reciprocity. If someone treats you badly, a natural, almost automatic assumption is that something about you specifically provoked or deserved that treatment. This assumption gets reinforced constantly throughout a relationship with a narcissist because their entire strategy, consciously or not, involves convincing you that their behavior is a response to something about you, rather than an expression of something entirely separate happening inside them that would have surfaced with almost anyone who occupied your position in their life. Understanding the 5 signs we walked through in the first half of this episode dismantles that question at its root. The compulsive need to be centered, the disproportionate reaction to criticism, the inability to tolerate solitude, the rapid discarding and retroactive devaluation, the bottomless emptiness that no achievement ever fills. None of these patterns have anything to do with who you specifically are. They were happening before you arrived, they'll continue happening after you leave, and they would surface with genuinely anyone who occupied the role you occupied in their life, because the mechanism driving all of it is internal to them, not a response to some unique flaw in you that provoked it. This reframe is genuinely liberating in a way that's hard to overstate if you haven't experienced it yet. It moves the entire relationship out of the category of something is wrong with me that made this happen, and into the much more accurate category of I happen to be present during someone else's ongoing, unresolved psychological suffering, and I absorbed the fallout of that suffering the way anyone in my position would have. This isn't about excusing what happened to you. It's about correctly locating where the actual cause lived, so that you can finally stop carrying blame that was never yours to hold in the first place. I want to talk about something specific this understanding does for your anger, because anger is often one of the hardest emotions to navigate honestly in the aftermath of these relationships. A lot of people feel guilty about their own anger toward a narcissist once they start understanding the suffering underneath the behavior, as though feeling angry at someone who's genuinely struggling internally makes you the unkind one in the story. I want to push back on that directly. Your anger is not in competition with their suffering. Both can be true simultaneously. They can be suffering from a genuinely painful internal architecture, and you can be angry about the real damage that suffering caused you, and neither of those truths cancels the other one out. Anger at real harm done to you is not cruelty. It's an appropriate, healthy response to having been hurt, regardless of what internal mechanism produced the hurt in the first place. In fact, understanding the suffering underneath the behavior often makes the anger cleaner, rather than eliminating it. Instead of an angry confusion tangled up with self-blame, why did they do this to me specifically? What does it say about me that they treated me this way? The anger can finally become simple, direct, and appropriately placed. They were suffering from something real, and instead of getting help for it, they caused real harm to the people closest to them, including me, and that harm deserved better than what it got. That's not an unkind conclusion, it's an honest one, and honest conclusions tend to heal far more completely than confused ones ever can. Now, I want to say something about what this understanding does not require of you, because I think it's important to close this out with real clarity rather than vague inspiration. It does not require you to communicate any of this to them. It does not require you to offer them grace, patience, or another chance unless you genuinely, freely choose to, for your own reasons, completely separate from any sense of obligation created by understanding their pain. It does not require you to feel sorry for them in any ongoing, active way that keeps you emotionally entangled in their well-being. You are allowed to understand the mechanism fully, feel a kind of distant, abstract compassion for the suffering itself, and still want absolutely nothing to do with the person carrying it for the rest of your life. All of these things can coexist without contradiction. What this understanding does provide, and it's genuinely valuable, is a permanent shift in how you interpret every future encounter with patterns like this, whether from the same person or someone new. You'll recognize the compulsive centering, the disproportionate reaction to feedback, the discomfort with solitude, the rapid discarding, the bottomless hunger for validation, not as evidence of your own inadequacy, but as the visible signature of an internal architecture that has nothing to do with you, wherever and whenever you encounter it again. And that recognition, arriving early rather than after months or years of confused self-blame, is one of the most protective gifts you can give yourself going forward. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've walked through today better than any explanation could. Picture a grand, elaborately decorated house standing at the end of a long driveway, the kind of house that draws attention from every direction. Ornate columns, gleaming windows, a facade so carefully maintained that anyone driving past assumes reasonably that whoever lives inside must be thriving completely, must have everything perfectly in order behind those polished walls. But walk closer, and you start to notice things the distant view conceals. The foundation, beneath all that ornamentation, was never actually poured deep enough to support the weight of everything built on top of it. Every room inside is arranged not for comfort, not for genuine living, but for how it photographs, how it impresses whoever happens to be looking, because the house was never actually built to be lived in peacefully. It was built to be seen, admired, envied from a careful, appropriate distance. And deep inside, in the rooms nobody else ever gets shown, there's a persistent, uncomfortable draft that never quite goes away, no matter how many expensive fixtures get added to distract from it, no matter how much effort goes into maintaining the impressive facade visible from the road. The people who live in a house like this spend enormous amounts of energy managing everyone else's impression of what's happening inside, precisely because what's actually happening inside, if it were ever fully seen, would reveal something much colder, much emptier, much more fragile than the exterior ever suggested. This is not a house you need to fix. It's not your responsibility to reinforce someone else's foundation, to warm rooms that were never built to hold real warmth in the first place, to keep polishing a facade that was always going to require more upkeep than any single person could sustainably provide. You're allowed to see the house clearly, understand exactly why the draft exists, why the rooms feel the way they feel, why the facade needed to be so elaborate in the first place, and still simply walk back down that driveway toward a home of your own that was actually built to hold real warmth, real comfort, real stability, without needing anyone standing outside it, admiring the view in order to feel like it was worth building at all.